The Art of Glenn Gould, Take 13. A weekly series in which Mr. Gould is heard in conversation with Ken Haslam. Their conversation this week deals with two works from the chamber music repertoire, Robert Schumann's Quartet for Piano and Strings, and Arnold Schoenberg's song cycle, The Book of the Hanging Gardens, in which Mr. Gould is joined by the American mezzo-soprano Helen Vanni, and which, as they say in radio, is already in progress.
Glenn, that's an extraordinarily beautiful work.
Isn't it? And superbly sung, I think, by Helen Vanni.
Who was the poet? Stefan Georg?
Yeah, Schoenberg seems to have had a great fondness for his multi-ment verse at that period.
Which was when? Around the First World War?
Yeah, just a bit before, I think. I think the Hanging Gardens songs date from 1908 or 9, something like that.
Yeah.
It's really his first substantial work, I guess, without a constant key center reference. You know, the piano pieces, Opus 11, are supposed to have launched the atonal period officially, but several of those songs predate them, I think. And of course, I guess the very first instance of tonality less vocabulary for Schoenberg came with neither of those works, but with the second string quartet, where the last two movements added a soprano voice to the quartet texture, and again employed text by Stefan Georg significantly or not.
Wasn't that the occasion for one of Schoenberg's more celebrated double entendre, Glenn? I feel the breath of other planets blowing.
Right. As I say, Stefan Georg's verse seems to have been metaphorically implicated in the whole process of his development at that time.
Well, Glenn, I imagine that you've spent a fair amount of time studying influences that Schoenberg acknowledged, or even some of those he didn't readily admit to, like Richard Strauss.
Right.
Because I know you've been recording virtually all of his lieder and chamber music in the last couple of years, and of course a great deal of it stems from that era, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's true.
But you know, Glenn, I couldn't help thinking as we listened to the Schoenberg, which, by the way, wasn't heard in its entirety, was it?
No, I deleted 3 of the songs to make way for this conversation, Ken.
Yeah, Mr. Gould, I do wish you'd mastered the technique of stopwatch one of these days.
Sorry about that.
Anyway, as I was saying, I couldn't help thinking that apart from the Schoenberg project and a few offbeat items like the Strauss Enoch Arden, you've rarely ventured into chamber music, at least on records.
No, that's quite true.
Well, is this from choice, Glenn, or lack of opportunity, or the result of some deep-seated personality quirk that renders you temperamentally unfit for collegial give and take?
I honestly don't know how to answer that, Ken. I always think that I'm going to enjoy any chamber music project that comes along, you know. And indeed, some of them, like those leader sessions with Helen Vanni, are sheer delight. No friction, no major disagreements about tempi, no need to pose the Gerald Moore-type questions, you know.
Am I too loud, you mean?
Exactly. No, there's been none of that in the Schoenberg sessions with Helen Vanni. But generally, I admit that where chamber music is concerned, I'm sort of like the kid who suffers through the school week in the expectation that somehow or other the weekend is going to compensate for all that drudgery, you know, with all that freedom to look forward to and Monopoly games and into the wee small hours.
You're dating yourself, Mr. Gould.
Oh, can't help it. Monopoly, I mean. Well, that's how I spent my school weekends anyway. But of course, you know, when the weekend arrives, the kid who lives off that sort of expectation all week long finds that it's those very activities that make him cranky and out of sorts with his playmates, precisely because the expectations, I guess, that were built into them were just unrealizable, you know.
Are you trying to tell us something about the Schumann Quartet sessions, Glenn?
Yeah, I guess I am. We weren't speaking to each other by the time the sessions came to an end, Ken, which was pretty childish, I admit, but that's the way it was.
The we being the Juilliard Quartet?
Members of, yeah.
Well, just how great were the differences? Were they involved with subtleties that pass in the night, Glenn, or were they the sort of thing that anyone would notice straight off?
They were pretty basic, Ken. If I can offer my services as counsel for the defense for a minute, I think they would have said that we came to a parting of the ways on one particular point that made any real musical reconciliation just about impossible.
And that was?
That was a notion I have that it's impractical to treat chamber music as a world apart. You know, I don't think it is. Certainly historically it isn't. The difference between a string quartet and a symphony of the classical period, let's say, or even the Romantic era, is purely textual. It's in no way formal. So I just don't buy that whole elaborate mystique of the chamber music cult, you know. I don't believe that it takes some holier-than-thou dedication, some selfless renunciation of the virtuoso impulse in order to play chamber music effectively.
Yeah, any more than the other music, really.
Exactly. I think if you genuinely love music, you renounce those things anyway. I think that goes without saying. And I think that there isn't any particular correlation between that self-denying impulse and the sheer size of the forces involved. I think that if you do renounce the ego gratification because of your love for music, it doesn't really matter whether you're joined by 4 colleagues or 104, you know.
Somehow, listening between the lines, I get the impression Messrs. Juilliard Quartet thought your interpretation of the Schumann a bit symphonic, Glenn?
Yeah, that's true, Ken. Acting as their advocate on this occasion, I would have to tell the court, in order to depict my own contribution accurately, that it was perhaps over-symphonicized, relentlessly up-tempo driven, shall we say.
Well, how did all this come out in the editorial wash, Glenn? I mean, after all, there are takes to be chosen, balances agreed upon, and so forth. You know, acetates to be approved.
Yeah, well, all I can say is that I love this performance, Ken. Of course, it turns out to be relentlessly driven, symphonically inclined.
But how, with 3 protesting colleagues, is that possible?
I do my own editing.
That was the broadcast premiere of a soon-to-be-released recording featuring Glenn Gould and 3 reluctant members of the Juilliard String Quartet in a performance of Robert Schumann's quartet for piano, violin, viola, and violoncello, and it has concluded this week's edition of The Art of Glenn Gould. Earlier in the program, we heard 12 of the 15 songs from Arnold Schoenberg's song cycle based on poems of Stefan Georgi, the Book of the Hanging Gardens, in a performance which featured the American mezzo-soprano Helen Vanni. Next week, 3 works for solo piano, Mozart's Sonata in D major, K311, the 3 intermezzi, Opus 117 by Brahms, and variations by the Canadian composer Jacques Etieux. This program was produced in Toronto by Richard Coulter, with technical operations by Lauren Tulk. And this is Bill Hawes speaking.